let's think about what happens at the onset of exercise. And this comes from a paper from Andy Jones and Mark Burnley in 2009. It's a really good paper, so it's worth having a read of this. So they state this. At the onset of exercise, and depending upon the distance, duration and training status, the ATP turnover rate in the contracting muscle might increase as much as 100-fold over the first few seconds. So let's pause there. So this is fundamentally really important. As soon as we start to exercise, there is no delay in the ATP turnover rate. That is instantaneous. In other words, as soon as the muscle is engaged, the amount of muscle mass that needs to be engaged is a function really of the degree of neural recruitment. Therefore, if those fibers need to lengthen and shorten, that ability to lengthen and shorten and therefore generate power is a function of the amount of ATP that can be turned over, so the ATP turnover rate. And so that is an instantaneous response. So we go from a resting state, we do what's called a square wave transition. That is, we go from rested to an immediate increase in ATP turnover rate. And that is what happens, irrespective of the exercise intensity. And as the boys have written here, this could be a 100-fold increase in a matter of seconds. But remember that you only have enough ATP, stored ATP, about 85 grams in most individuals, for a single maximal muscular contraction. So the next statement becomes pertinent. To prevent a catastrophic reduction in ATP and almost immediate exhaustion, ATP is resynthesized through an acceleration of both the creatine kinase reaction, with a consequent reduction to muscle phosphocreatine, and the glycolytic rate. So again, let's just pause. And this is a really important aspect, which is we've only got enough ATP for that single maximal muscular contraction. The whole notion really of metabolism is how we resynthesize that ATP. And the immediate source, irrespective of the exercise intensity, the immediate, instantly available source is through the creatine kinase reaction. Fundamentally, the breakdown in creatine to give us ATP, and then we end up with kind of a reduction in the phosphocreatine pool. But at the same time, that is also a limited source, as I'm sure you'll remember from previous sessions on exercise physiology. It is quite limited. So although we have quite a high degree of power that can be generated from the creatine kinase reaction, the sustainability is actually fairly limited, even under aerobic conditions, by the way. So we then obviously start to rely on substrate level glycolysis. But if we rely on the glycolysis, what we know from previous learning is that you get an increase in hydrogen ion concentration and lactate production. The result of these combined processes is that we stimulate an increase in oxidative phosphorylation, and therefore we see that in VO2 measured at the mouth. So all that this is stating for us is, irrespective of the exercise intensity, as soon as you start to exercise, there's an immediate increase in ATP turnover rate that is met by creatine kinase reaction, that is the breakdown of phosphocreatine. It is supplemented by glycolysis until we reach a steady state. That is where the VO2 matches the QO2 in the muscle. So all we are doing is supplementing our energy turnover at the onset of exercise by using these non-aerobic sources. It's not that we're not working aerobically at the onset of exercise, it is just that, as we're about to see, there is a delay in the ability for the aerobic system to meet that instantaneous ATP turnover rate. But anaerobic metabolism can do that instantly because there is an abundance of creatine, or a relative abundance of creatine, in the cell that can be broken down almost instantaneously. And so this is what we see at the onset of exercise. So this is from Andy Jones and Dave Paul. So what we've got here is we've got a schematic representation of a VO2 response. So here we've got perhaps somebody sitting at rest or at rest prior to exercise. We've got about a 40-second period here. So VO2 wouldn't be changing because we're not engaging any muscle. At time point 0, the participant is asked to exercise at a fixed exercise intensity. They start immediately. The key thing to understand is that you then get the square wave increase in ATP turnover rate, or whatever that is, and this is just a stylized response. The degree to the increase in ATP turnover rate is a function of the load that is being applied. So if I'm exercising at 90 watts compared to 30 watts, my ATP turnover rate, the energetic ATP demand and the ATP turnover rate is far greater. So therefore, the degree to which this imaginary line here rises is a function of the imposed load on the muscle. If we then follow the VO2 response, which is this line here, what we see is that the VO2 itself, the oxygen uptake, does not rise instantaneously. That there is this delay-like response. And in fact, we start to see it doesn't really start to level out until about 120 seconds into the bout of exercise. And there's a very logical reason for this. If we think about it very, very, very simply, the reason that the VO2 doesn't suddenly shoot up instantaneously is our ability to use oxygen. If we go back to that previous schematic, which was the cogs, you'll remember that the ability to deliver oxygen to the tissue is a function of the respiratory response, that's the tidal volume of the breathing frequency, the cardiac response, which is the stroke volume and the heart rate, and then what is going on at the tissue, which is the AVO2 difference, the extraction of oxygen at the tissue. So if we were to go with the assumption, well, VO2 does rise instantaneously at the onset of exercise, there would have to be an instantaneous increase in heart rate. There would have to be an instantaneous increase in minute ventilation. There would have to be an instantaneous increase in AVO2 difference to match those demands. And yet we know that there isn't. Why do we know that there isn't? Well, think about it very logically. For the heart to operate, the heart itself has to be oxygenated. So as you take that oxygen in and the ATP demand goes up, the heart responds to this and recognizes it needs to be beating at a faster rate, but it needs oxygen to achieve this. So that oxygen has to come in through the system, it has to be passed through the lung, it has to be passed into the circulation, and then through the kind of the redistribution of blood flow, some of it will end up at the heart, some will end up at the diaphragm, some will end up at the tissue. And it is that process of that VO2 being delivered to allow those responses to increase to meet the demand that takes time. So the net result is we've got muscle that is now operating at its required rate because it's got this increase in ATP turnover rate. We've got oxygen that is not actually meeting the demand. This line here represents really the theoretical VO2 response. You see it levels out here. So, you know, were it to rise instantaneously, it would have, you'd have gone instantly up and started from here. So, as we saw on the previous slide from Jones and Burnley, the way that we operate is that we borrow energy from non-anaerobic sources. So we borrow it from the high energy phosphates, both ATP, instantaneously of course, then phosphocreatine, and then of course through glycolysis. And so what this area here represents, so the area under this zone here, that represents what we call the oxygen deficit. In other words, the difference between the oxygen that should have been consumed and the amount that has been consumed had there been an instantaneous increase in VO2 to meet its steady state requirements. And so it is this response here, the kinetics of that oxygen, that is of real interest to us as exercise physiologists and clinical physiologists, because it is this response that tells us an awful lot about fitness and health of the individual. Now, we've seen this schematic in previous sessions if you've been following these session by session. And this is from the textbook of Work Physiology by Aslan and Rodal. And I want you to just focus for the moment on panel A. And I've put the pink line on to help us with this a little bit. So what you see here is a series of constant load exercise bouts. And each exercise bout is about 5 minutes in duration. And you can see the concomitant increase in VO2 response, that's what these lines here represent, in relation to the 50 watt increase in exercise intensity. And what I want you to do is just have a little think as you look at this and you know, say in your own mind or shout it out, doesn't matter. What do you notice that is different between the VO2 responses for each workload. And if you need to, just pause the video for a moment, because I will just carry on. Well, the difference is you'll see threefold, apologies. Firstly, as we perhaps already understand, that the oxygen cost of exercise increases pretty much in proportion to the increase in the VO2, in proportion to the increase in exercise intensity. And we've learned in previous weeks that's like a linear-like response. And if you look on panel B, this is the linear-like response that we see. These are averages based upon these responses here. The second thing that we notice is that for each of these trials, as we saw previously, there is an O2 deficit. So here's that kind of baseline phase, and then the VO2 rises, but it takes time to reach steady state. So we always get the deficit, irrespective of whether we're working at a 50 watt workload or, for example, at a 250 watt workload up here. But the third thing that you'll notice is, and this is why the pink line is here, is as the intensity of the exercise increases, the time taken to reach steady state, that is the time taken for the VO2 measured at the mouth to match the QO2 at the muscle and therefore match the ATP turnover rate, takes longer. It's taking longer to reach steady state. So whereas down here we're reaching steady state in about 90 seconds, by the time we get up here it may be 2.5 minutes. So there's a huge difference in terms of what is happening. And if we think, well, why is the deficit getting bigger? Well, remember that, as we said on the previous slide, as the intensity goes up and you need to engage more muscle, there's going to be a greater ATP demand, therefore the ATP turnover rate will be higher. Because you need the energy instantaneously, you would have to borrow more anaerobic energy to meet that, remembering that we can't supply the oxygen to the tissue instantaneously. And so the deficit gets bigger because we've got to borrow more energy. And you can see that reflected in panel B by the blood lactate concentration. Remember that the blood lactate concentration is our proxy measure for substrate level glycolysis, so it reflects to us fundamentally what is going on glycolytically. And so what you can see here is that as the intensity increases, so does the blood lactate concentration, because you're having to borrow, predominantly this is what it's the result of, not solely, but predominantly because you're having to borrow more energy at the onset of exercise. Of course, it's also partly a function of the fact that once we move beyond lactate turn point, we are progressively recruiting more fast-twitch muscle fibers, but that perhaps is something to park for, which is covered in another session. Well, if we go back to the work from Paul and Jones in 2012, this is kind of gives a real explanation as to why this is so important as a parameter, why we're interested in oxygen uptake kinetics. And they write this: because of the very limited non-oxidative muscle energy stores, and they're referring to here things like phosphocreatine and glycogen and so on. At the transition for rest or exercise, there must be a coordinated pulmonary, cardiovascular and muscular system response to increase rapidly the flux of O2 from the atmosphere to the muscle mitochondria, allowing aerobic ATP production. Thus, the transitory phases prior to the achievement of steady state provides a window into the fundamental processes of muscle energetics and metabolic control that are otherwise not accessible. In other words, it's almost impossible in real time to evaluate what is going on in the muscle using non-anaerobic metabolism. You can't do muscle biopsies in real time. It's very hard to put somebody in a dual magnet scanner, for example, but you can make pretty good interpretations of what's going on using non-anaerobic sources by the size of the O2 deficit that we've just been looking at. So this provides us with really important information.